The hearing room was thick with static tension, a quiet hum of cameras clicking, pens scratching, and barely muffled sighs echoing beneath the grand mahogany arches of the Capitol. Fluorescent lights washed the scene in cold brightness, casting harsh reflections on glass water pitchers and the polished nameplates in front of each lawmaker. At the far end of the panel sat Jasmine Crockett, her expression calm but alert, eyes sharp as razors beneath perfectly arched brows. Across from her, with a smirk etched into his face like it was part of his skin, Jesse Waters leaned into his microphone and cut her off for the 9th time. "It's not that complicated, Congresswoman," he interrupted. Again, his tone was dismissive, sing-song, as if mocking a child in front of a crowd. Jasmine didn't flinch. She looked down at her notes, smoothed the edge of the paper with a slow precision. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Instead, she let silence stretch between them, an elastic band pulled to its limit. Waters tapped his pen twice against the desk, fidgeting. Someone coughed. Another camera clicked behind Jasmine. Aides stiffened. Across the dais, a few representatives turned their heads slightly, sensing something shift. The air changed. The moment was no longer just another exchange. It was a standoff, and Jasmine didn't blink to understand the gravity of that moment. You'd have to rewind time back to before this hearing, before the grandstanding and the smirking interruptions. Back to Dallas, where a young black attorney with fire in her gut and truth in her voice stood before juries and judges, defending the voiceless and dismantling systemic cruelty one argument at a time. Before she wore the blue congressional pin, she wore scars, not visible, but felt every court battle, every racist whisper in a hallway, every "you're articulate for a black woman" compliment laced with poison. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise by playing it safe. She rose by being undeniable. Even in law school, her professors spoke of her as the scalpel, not loud, but surgical. She had a way of waiting until the room thought she was done, and then cutting to the heart of the matter with a sentence so direct it left no room for defense. When she transitioned into politics, that same edge followed her. She didn't do viral rants. She didn't chase sound bites. But when the moment came, she struck, and it echoed. Across the aisle, Jesse Waters had built a different kind of legacy. Media-trained, brash, always 3 seconds away from a smirk. He'd made a career out of needling his opponents on cable TV. He knew how to manipulate airtime, twist narratives, and get under skin like a splinter. He didn't come to Capitol Hill to debate. He came to dominate, to provoke. But Congress wasn't cable news. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't a co-host. She was an opponent. One with discipline and a deep well of patience. Until it ran out, the hearing was supposed to be about political transparency, a dry, procedural affair. But once Waters got the floor, it turned theatrical. He came armed with innuendo and talking points disguised as questions. His tone carried a veneer of politeness that barely concealed a sneer. "Well, if the Congresswoman is done emoting," he began during one exchange. "I haven't begun," Jasmine replied coldly, but Waters had already cut her off. The interruptions weren't just rude, they were strategic. Meant to destabilize, to push her into a reaction, to make her the headline, not her argument. Each time she began to speak, he would interject, talk over her, reframe the question. It was a chess game played with smirks and gavel threats, and yet she held her line. The 9th time he cut her off, it was over a statistic, a simple number she was citing from the Department of Justice report. He waved a hand dismissively and said, "We've heard enough of that." As if the truth were a nuisance, and then it happened. She put her pen down, folded her hands, sat back in her chair. Silence, the kind of silence that doesn't fall. It rises. Jasmine stared directly at Waters. She wasn't angry. She wasn't flustered. She looked like a lawyer waiting for her client's lie to collapse under cross-examination. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. "Are you finished?" Waters opened his mouth, then stopped. She leaned forward slightly, just enough for the microphone to catch every syllable of her next sentence, the 10th sentence. "Because if you keep interrupting, I'll assume it's because you're afraid of what happens when I actually finish a thought." There it was. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. No one spoke. Not Waters, not the chair, not the aides whispering behind her. A low murmur swept through the chamber, followed by complete stillness. Waters blinked, but said nothing. The smirk drained from his face like color from a photo. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk back. She simply turned a page in her notes and waited for the next question. That was all it took. The room, once hostile and performative, had transformed. Members who had been checking phones or whispering among themselves now sat straight. Jasmine had done what few could, not by shouting, but by forcing silence to speak for her, and outside that room, the world was listening. The clip hit Twitter before the gavel even fell. Within 15 minutes, #Crockett10th was trending nationally. Someone stitched it with a meme of gladiators saluting before battle. TikTok users reenacted the sentence like it was Shakespeare. Instagram Reels cut it into slow motion with orchestral music swelling behind her voice. One account posted, "This is what Grace under fire looks like." Commenters wrote, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the room's IQ." Jasmine Crockett just taught a masterclass in courtroom control. Her sentence deserves to be in a museum. News outlets picked it up by evening. MSNBC replayed the clip on a loop with a chyron that read, "The sentence that silenced Waters." Fox tried to spin it, emotional outburst from left-wing representative. But even that headline fell flat when the footage showed the opposite. She was calm. He was chaotic. Inside Capitol Hill, something shifted. In the cloakrooms, Republican aides whispered. She made him look weak. Democratic staffers shared high fives in elevators. Some members who rarely praised across the aisle admitted, not publicly, but behind closed doors, that she'd won the moment without theatrics. Just precision. Waters, for his part, went into damage control. That night on his show, he barely mentioned the exchange. Instead, he shifted topics. But even his regular viewers noticed the omission. Comment sections filled with clips of Jasmine's line and jokes about his 9-time failure. Meanwhile, Jasmine walked the halls with the same calm that she had always carried. She didn't rush to comment. She didn't tweet a victory lap. She didn't need to. The power of her sentence was in its restraint, and the world responded to that. The next morning, in an interview on a morning news program, when asked about the exchange, she smiled faintly. "I think people are tired of noise," she said. "Sometimes silence tells you exactly who's listening, and who's just waiting to interrupt." Her words weren't just about that moment. They were about a wider reckoning in American politics, about women, especially women of color, being spoken over, doubted, underestimated, but also about the cost of patience, the discipline of knowing when to speak, and when to make silence the loudest response. Some said it was just one sentence, but others knew better. It was a scalpel, and it left a scar. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's 10-word comeback rippled through Capitol Hill and across the country, you have to go back to where her fire was forged, not in a political war room or on a news segment, but in the quiet grind of courtroom after courtroom in Dallas, Texas. Long before she took a seat in Congress, Jasmine was a civil rights attorney, walking into rooms where no one expected her to lead. She carried her case files in one hand and her clients' hopes in the other, stepping into spaces that tried to size her down the moment she entered. The courthouse ceilings were high, but the stares she met were often low, condescending, sometimes hostile, always watching. She learned quickly that being twice as prepared wasn't a strategy, it was survival. She didn't have the luxury of faltering. One stammer, one misplaced word, and it wasn't just her credibility at stake, it was the client sitting beside her who couldn't afford bail, couldn't call their boss, couldn't explain to their kids why they were gone. She built her reputation the hard way. She didn't just win cases, she exposed contradictions. Judges remembered her because she didn't grandstand. She surgically dismantled. Her colleagues called her steel under pressure, and that wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. If you crossed her, you'd better be right. And even if you were, you'd still be tired by the time she finished with you. When Ferguson happened, when the streets filled with fire and pain and desperate cries for justice, Jasmine wasn't tweeting about it. She was there, she flew in, she met families. She helped file lawsuits. She stood in the back of churches filled with mourners and the front of meetings filled with rage. That was the moment her fire changed shape. Law wasn't enough. She saw the gears of policy trending too slowly, chewing through lives. So she ran. It wasn't glamorous. It was gritty. Door-knocking in districts that didn't know her name, challenging entrenched power, facing down smear campaigns that tried to paint her as radical, aggressive, divisive. She wore it all like armor. The barbs, the dismissals, the donors who said she was too bold. She won anyway. When she arrived in Congress, it wasn't as a newcomer eager to fit in. She walked in with the confidence of someone who'd survived much worse than a committee hearing. She wasn't there to play nice with microphones or trade softball questions with anchors. She was there because the same discipline that let her survive a courtroom where her skin color and voice made her a target was the same discipline needed to cut through the noise of Washington. Still, Washington tried her patience. She watched colleagues with less experience, fewer facts, and louder voices dominate airtime. She watched hearings devolve into shouting matches and headlines chase the loudest lie. And through it all, she waited. Not because she was afraid to speak, but because she knew something most politicians had forgotten: silence is never empty. It's a reservoir. So when she sat across from Jesse Waters, taking the 9th interruption, without flinching, she wasn't quiet because she was cornered. She was quiet because she had trained for this her entire life. Every courtroom stare, every "Miss Crockett, you may want to reconsider your tone," every insult masked as advice. She'd taken them all and distilled them into calm. Waters thought she was just another politician waiting for her turn. He didn't realize she had built her entire career on waiting for the right moment, and when that moment came, she didn't raise her voice. She changed the temperature of the room. That morning, the hearing room was already buzzing with reporters, each one scanning their phones for the day's storyline before it even unfolded. Most expected it to be routine, another panel, another partisan clash with predictable talking points. But the whispers began early. "Waters is going in on Crockett," someone murmured. The expectation wasn't debate. It was spectacle. Jesse Waters entered the chamber like a man entering his studio, broad shoulders, perfectly parted hair, and the confident stride of someone who believed the cameras would side with him no matter what he said. He greeted colleagues with nods and tight-lipped smiles, already mentally rehearsing the sound bites he'd clip for primetime. This wasn't about policy. It was about posturing. Jasmine sat already at the table, unmoved, her phone face down, her eyes fixed not on Waters, but on the stack of documents in front of her, each one marked with facts she knew he wouldn't want to hear. Her team had briefed her. He would goad, interrupt, minimize. He'd try to provoke a reaction he could weaponize. But she wasn't there to play a role in someone else's segment. She was there to finish a sentence. Then, if they let her, when the session opened, it started like any other: opening remarks, declarations of intent, the usual theater. Then Waters leaned in, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Congresswoman Crockett, can you explain why your party refuses to hold itself accountable?" It wasn't a question. It was bait. Jasmine responded calmly, outlining clear evidence from the committee's findings. But halfway through her second sentence, Waters waved his hand, cutting her off. "Let's not filibuster, Congresswoman," a few chuckled. Cameras zoomed in. The game had begun. He interrupted again and again, sometimes mid-word, sometimes with a laugh. Each time, Jasmine would stop, breathe, and re-enter her point with firm clarity. She didn't match his volume. She didn't match his sarcasm. She matched him with substance. The third interruption came with a smirk. "I just want a straight answer." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "I gave you one." The fifth came with exasperation. "You're not being clear." "I'm being precise," she replied. "There's a difference." By the seventh time, it wasn't just political theater. It was erasure in real time. A woman of color offering data, logic, and reason, being silenced by a man whose goal was to dominate, not discuss. People watching started to shift in their seats. The tension wasn't hidden anymore. It bled into the corners of the room. Aides. Pens hovered above notepads. Some reporters stopped typing. The ninth interruption hit like a scratch on a vinyl record. Jasmine had just begun laying out DOJ numbers about prosecutorial inconsistency when Waters, voice sharp, said, Yeah. We've heard the talking points. She stopped. Not because he won, but because she was about to dot, and then she waited. That silence wasn't indecision. It was something more calculated, like a blade drawn just before the strike. She could see it on his face. He didn't understand what he had just stepped into. Waters thought he was controlling the narrative. But the narrative was already slipping from his grasp, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't playing his game. She was rewriting it. She leaned slightly forward in her seat, her hands folded with deliberate calm, her voice steady and low enough that the room had to quiet just to hear her. Mr. Waters, she began. And even the way she said his name carried weight, measured, deliberate, not angry, but with the unmistakable edge of someone who'd been interrupted one too many times. You've interrupted me 9 times, she said plainly, her eyes locking with his. And each time I gave you more respect than you gave me. There was a pause, a hush. He blinked. I know what this is, she continued. It's not about facts for you. It's not about accountability, it's about control. About speaking over someone so the audience only hears noise. The chair creaked as she straightened up. Waters' smirk faltered, just a flicker, but enough. He opened his mouth to respond, but she raised her hand gently, but unmistakably. The room froze. I waited. I listened. I let you finish full sentences, even when those sentences were built on bad faith and shallow spin. I didn't interrupt because I was afraid to speak. I waited because I wanted everyone watching to see the difference. A few seats down, someone shifted uncomfortably. On the far side of the panel, another member tilted their head, lips pursed. Surprised, the camera zoomed in, sensing something bigger than politics happening in real time. What I represent, what you tried to silence, isn't just me, she said. It's every woman who's been spoken over in a boardroom. Every black professional who's had to smile through being called aggressive for simply stating a fact. Every American who knows exactly what it feels like to be told, your turn doesn't matter. Waters was no longer smiling. You thought interrupting me would shrink me, she said, her voice now ringing with a calm defiance that electrified the room. But what you did was give me silence, and I've learned how to turn silence into power. The room didn't breathe, not because she was loud, because she was right. Because in that 10th sentence, delivered with unshakable poise, she did what no retort, no insult, no raised voice could do. She told the truth, and the truth left the room silent. In the minutes after her final words, the silence in the room carried more weight than the entire morning's testimony. No one reached for their microphone. No one shuffled papers or cleared their throat. Jesse Waters, usually quick to regain footing with a rehearsed quip, sat frozen for a beat too long, staring at her like a man suddenly aware that he'd underestimated. The storm behind her, a staffer's phone lit up. Twitter now, X was already ablaze. Clips of the exchange, some barely 20 seconds long, were circulating with captions like, "She ended him with facts and grace." Another read, "Jasmine Crockett just gave every silenced voice a microphone." Within 15 minutes, #let her finish was trending nationwide. Teenagers in high schools were watching it between classes. Professors were pulling it up during political science lectures. Celebrities retweeted the moment with captions that ranged from "Queen energy" to "This is how you check a man," trying to drown out truth. In a Brooklyn barbershop, someone replayed the clip on loop. In a Houston church office, a pastor turned his laptop to show his assistant. "Watch how she holds her ground," he said, nodding slowly. That's not just politics, that's purpose. But it wasn't just the praise. There were attacks, 2 loud ones. Right-wing pundits scrambled to reframe the moment. Unprofessional, overly emotional, playing the race card, but it was too late. The tone had been set by the truth itself, and no rebrand could undo what millions had now seen with their own eyes. She didn't clap back. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood in the storm and made everyone else look small. Even in the quiet corridors outside the hearing room, you could feel it, the aftershock. Colleagues who had once dismissed her as new blood now looked at her with a new measure of caution. Staffers whispered her name. Opponents revised their strategies. And Jesse Waters? He didn't post a clip. He didn't mention her name on his show that night. He pivoted the story entirely, focusing on unrelated topics, pretending like the moment hadn't happened, but America saw it. And America remembered. For Jasmine, the moment wasn't a victory lap. It was a benchmark. After the hearing, when she stepped outside into the flash of cameras and questions, she didn't gloat. She didn't perform. I wasn't there to trend, she told one reporter. I was there to tell the truth. If the truth hits hard, maybe we need to start listening harder. And with that, she walked away calm, measured, unapologetic. Not because she needed the last word, but because she had already said everything that mattered. That evening, her phone buzzed with hundreds of notifications, mentions, DMs, screenshots, interviews requested from every major network. Her staff scrambled to manage the surge. MSNBC wanted her on by sunrise. CNN had sent a car. Even late-night hosts were quoting her now iconic 10th sentence. But Jasmine sat on the couch in her D.C. apartment, shoes off, hands resting quietly in her lap. Outside her window, the city buzzed as it always did, traffic, chatter, urgency in the streets. But inside she exhaled slowly. Not relief, not pride. Just stillness, because she'd known this would happen, not the exact words, not the viral storm, but the moment itself. She had trained for it not in media briefings, but in deposition rooms, in tense court hearings, in strategy sessions with families who had lost everything. She had sharpened her resolve like a blade, knowing someday, somewhere, someone would try to drown her voice, and she would need to be ready not just to speak, but to strike. Her chief of staff knocked gently and stepped in. We've got NBC at 7 a.m., The View called twice, and Senator Warren just texted, wants to connect. Jasmine smiled, but didn't stand. I'll do NBC, she said. Tell the others we'll space it out. This isn't about one night. It's about what comes next. Her team nodded, understanding the real work had just begun. On social media, edits of the moment flooded in. One showed her 10th sentence superimposed over still images of Rosa Parks, Anita Hill, Michelle Obama. Another layered her voice over a piano score, cutting to clips of black girls watching the hearing with wide eyes. Some laughed, some cried. All of them watched her, not as a viral figure, but as a blueprint. Meanwhile, her opponents fumbled. Jesse Waters' silence only made things worse. His own fanbase noticed the absence of a response, and when he finally addressed it, brushing it off with a shallow joke, the comment sections turned on him. You got owned, one wrote. Just admit it. The moment wasn't just viral. It was irreversible. Crockett had not just spoken truth to power, she'd turned the spotlight and made it clear who had none. And yet, even as the world reacted, Jasmine wasn't dwelling in the noise. She opened her laptop, reviewing policy notes for the next committee hearing. While the world crowned her a new voice of moral clarity, she was already moving to her next target, voting access reform, because the point had never been to win a moment. It was to move the needle. And now, with millions finally listening, she had no plans to waste a second of their attention. The following morning, as the sun broke over Capitol Hill, the ripple effects of Jasmine Crockett's moment had already turned into waves. Cable news ran the clip on loop, anchors dissecting her tone, her words, her composure. Social media platforms flooded with think pieces, fan art, even remixes of her 10th sentence layered over hip-hop beats in gospel choirs. But Jasmine was up early not to watch herself go viral, but to prepare for the day ahead. There were new voices reaching out, teachers asking her to speak to students, community leaders requesting Zoom appearances, and voters from across the aisle confessing they'd never heard her speak before yesterday, but now they couldn't stop. Listening. In a coffee shop near the Capitol, 2 women, one white, one Latina, sat watching the clip on a tablet. One whispered, "She said everything I've wanted to say in every meeting where I got talked over." The other nodded, eyes glassy. She didn't even raise her voice. That's what made it land. And Jasmine felt that energy everywhere she went that day. Elevators paused longer. Colleagues offered nods, some sincere, some grudging. But the most striking shift was unspoken. Where before she might have been underestimated, now she was unavoidable inside the House chamber. She took her seat, the weight of new expectations pressing gently on her shoulders. It wasn't about ego. It was about reach. As the session began, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee leaned over and whispered, "They're listening now." Jasmine didn't smile, but her eyes acknowledged the truth. What followed that day wasn't another grand confrontation. It was quieter. She submitted a motion to address sentencing disparities. She referenced data. She called for bipartisan review, not with fire, but with surgical precision. And though some still tried to dismiss or dodge, their tone had shifted. She had done something rare in modern politics, made people stop and actually hear a black woman speak without interruption, and then realize how much they'd missed by not listening sooner. Back online, the moment took on new life. Civil rights organizations referenced her remarks in fundraising campaigns. High school debate teams wrote entire cases around the clip. A Chicago principal wrote, "Today we showed our girls what power sounds like." But Jasmine stayed rooted in her purpose. She responded to none of the praise directly. No victory lap tweet. No cable news vanity tour. Just continued work. Because if yesterday was her voice breaking through the noise, today was the beginning of making that voice permanent. And she knew the system doesn't change with a single sentence. It changes when you refuse to stop speaking, even after the cameras turn away. Later that week, Jasmine sat alone in her office as dusk fell outside the Capitol. The overhead lights were off, only the amber glow of a desk lamp illuminated the room, casting soft shadows against walls lined with framed photographs and newspaper clippings from home. She scrolled through her inbox, pausing on one email. The subject line read, "From my daughter, with thanks." She opened it. It was from a mother in Des Moines, a nurse. Exhausted, overworked, unsure if politics had room for people like her anymore. Her teenage daughter had seen Jasmine's clip in a civics class, then came home that night asking about Congress, the law, and how to stand up when your voice feels small. She said, "Mom, I want to be like her." She didn't yell. She didn't back down. She just do. Jasmine exhaled slowly, the words cutting through the fatigue like light. This was why. Not the trending hashtags, not the primetime attention, but the ripple no algorithm could measure. A girl in Iowa watching someone who looked like her speak with clarity and strength and conviction in a room designed to silence her. There were dozens more messages like it, some short, others paragraphs long. Young women, teachers, fathers, veterans, people who never paid attention to congressional hearings until now, and amid those messages, others from within the machine, political veterans she once admired from afar, now asking for meetings. Leaders proposing policy collaborations. A few even offering quiet apologies for previously overlooking her, but Jasmine didn't need apologies. She needed votes. And allies. And space, because the system she had challenged didn't collapse when she delivered that 10th sentence. It merely blinked. Now came the harder part, forcing it to see her every time she stood. From her window, she could see the Capitol dome glowing white against the night sky, still and regal, hiding all the noise beneath it. She watched it in silence for a long moment, then reached for a pen and began outlining a new draft bill, focused on media accountability and bias in congressional proceedings. This wasn't revenge. It was reconstruction. And she knew the moment had cracked something open. Not just in the walls of Congress, but in the country, a crack wide enough for sunlight. For new voices. For truth spoken plainly, without apology. That was her task now, not to relive the moment, but to build on it. Until the silence she earned became policy. Until justice wasn't just a soundbite, but law, and she would not stop until that became reality. 2 days later, she walked into the Judiciary Committee hearing room once again. Same polished floor, same ornate walls, same rows of cameras poised like vultures, but the energy had shifted. Reporters stood a little straighter as she passed. A few Republican aides glanced up, then quickly looked away. The air was charged not with tension, but with caution. She took her seat with the quiet poise of someone who understood the room now bent around her presence. Not the other way around? Waters was already seated across the table. He avoided eye contact, flipping through papers he didn't appear to read. The chair opened the session with the usual procedural call, but the audience wasn't watching the docket, they were watching her. She didn't come in looking for another viral moment. She came with data, citations, and questions no one wanted to answer. When she spoke, her voice was low but unyielding, threading logic through stone walls. She cornered one witness into admitting that the very law they were debating disproportionately affected women of color. Another tried to brush it off, but she responded without raising her voice. That's not a perception problem. That's a statistical reality. And this body has a responsibility to recognize reality when it walks into the room. One of the Republican members interjected to pivot the discussion. She let him finish, then calmly returned the focus to the facts. Again, no interruptions. No raised voices. Just a woman reclaiming space with words that cut clean. A clip of her exchange with the witness circulated before the hearing even ended. Not for fireworks, but for clarity, for discipline. People began calling it the Crockett Doctrine. Speak once with truth. Let them interrupt themselves. Outside the chamber, reporters hounded her with questions. Do you feel vindicated? Did you expect this kind of response? She paused only briefly before answering, her tone unwavering. I didn't come here to be a moment, I came here to work. If the moment helps the work, I'll take it. But the work comes first. That clip, too, made the rounds, but it wasn't trending because she embarrassed someone. It was trending because she embodied what politics could be: fact-driven, calm, defiant in silence, unstoppable in truth. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. A freshman Republican from Nevada, previously dismissive, crossed the aisle after a hearing to say, I may not agree with you. Or do you? And Jasmine nodded. Not because she needed his validation, but because even in that small acknowledgement, she saw something shifting. The doors that had once been locked were now cracked open, not all the way, but enough for more voices. To follow, that weekend, Jasmine returned home to Texas for the first time since the hearing. The sun beat down on the tarmac as she stepped off the plane, the dry summer heat wrapping around her like a familiar memory. At the terminal exit, a small group waited, not press. Not staffers, just family, neighbors, and the kind of people who'd watched her climb from courtrooms to Congress. Her mother was first to hug her, arms tight, silent, no praise, no fuss. Just presence. At the community center in South Dallas, a welcome event had been thrown together with almost no notice. Folding chairs, a sheet cake, someone's uncle working the soundboard with borrowed speakers, but the room was full. Young girls sat in the front rows, eyes wide. Ministers, barbers, high school teachers stood in the back, not because she was famous, but because she had made people feel seen. When Jasmine finally took the mic, the crowd went silent, not the kind of hush that comes before cheering, but the kind that leans in. I didn't come here to talk about Washington. She sighed. I came to talk about here, about us. Because this place, this block, this city taught me how to use my voice. And last week, when they tried to take it from me, I remembered every moment I wasn't allowed to finish a sentence growing up. And I said no more. Applause rose, not in bursts, but waves. She looked down at the young girls in the front row. One of them held a homemade sign. I hear you, I see me. That was it. That was the legacy already forming, not just what she said in a committee room, but what echoed out of it. A generation watching her stand firm and understanding that they could too. That evening, as the sun began to dip, she stood on her childhood porch and sipped sweet tea while watching kids run barefoot down the street. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her chief of staff. CNN confirms, most impactful moment of the year. She didn't smile, just watched the horizon and whispered, let's make sure it's not the last. Because she knew the cameras would move on, the news cycle would shift. But the silence she broke had already traveled far beyond one room. One sentence, one headline. It had planted something, and Jasmine Crockett was just getting started.